so much for the opportunity to speak with you all today. And I am Paul Kelway. I'm the Executive Director of International Bird Rescue. We're really delighted to be here and certainly very appreciative of the opportunity to speak with you all today. A little bit about what we do, and also, and specifically, as far as our own wildlife rescue work, what we did last year in the Gulf of Mexico following the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. Just to start with, an apology that you may have noticed that on the schedule for the conference, my colleague Barbara Callahan is listed as speaking today. Barbara is our Response Services Director, and last week I had to send her to New Zealand. Some of you may have heard that there's a container ship that ran aground off the coast of the North Island of New Zealand, and since the beginning of last week we've now sent 6 of our team to support the local authorities and wildlife rescuers there with that spill. Barbara is leading our team on the ground, and she sends her apologies that she couldn't be with us today, but certainly her loss is my gain, and I've been able to come here actually to Brazil for the first time, and delighted to be able to speak with you in her stead. So a little bit about our mission. Very specific. Our focus has always been on aquatic birds, so not even all birds, very specifically aquatic birds. And our history has a lot to do with oil spill response, and really this speciality has come about because in many oil spill situations it is aquatic birds that are most heavily impacted. And of course this is very much to do with the fact that they inhabit the ocean surface, either living or feeding, and certainly have the most potential to become oiled in an oil spill situation. We specialize in a number of areas, of course responding to oil spills, the rehabilitation of aquatic birds, and also the planning and training, preparing for oil spill response, as well as research into really furthering our techniques for how we respond and how many animals we're able to save. We actually celebrated our 40th anniversary this year, so we've been going since 1971. And we were born, in fact, after an oil spill in the San Francisco Bay Area. And at that time, the founder of our organization was one of the volunteers that responded to that oil spill. It was complete chaos. There was many people trying to help, no organized and coordinated effort. There was 7,000 animals that were impacted, and I'm not sure if any of them survived, sadly. But what that did was really inspire her to begin to formalize an organization that could begin to understand how to successfully conduct this work and how to do it in an organized way that really allowed us to really pool resources and work together. Out of that oil spill in 1971, there was many years of research into the techniques, how to wash oiled birds, understanding of the intricacies of the rehabilitation process, and out of that came the first ever written protocols on saving oiled seabirds. Since then we've responded all over the world, and I think probably one of the largest efforts we've been involved in was the response in 2000 to an oil spill caused by a cargo ship, the Treasure in South Africa. That impacted 40,000 African penguins, 20,000 of which were oiled. And the International Bird Rescue Team was a key component of the management of that response effort, and I'm pleased to say that we were able to release almost 94% of those animals. And then of course last year the Deepwater Horizon oil spill response, which was unprecedented in a different way, I think really in terms of the geography that was the size of that spill. So our operations are based in predominantly in California, but we have personnel and facilities in a number of states on the west coast of the US. We operate 2 year-round aquatic bird rescue facilities. Our main office is in Long Beach, and I was delighted to learn that Long Beach is Praia Grande in Portuguese, and I feel very much at home being so close to Long Beach again here. We also have a wildlife response center in Alaska and a number of staff, one in the Pacific Northwest and another up in Anchorage, Alaska. In the last 40 years, we've responded to over 200 oil spills in over a dozen countries, so we have expertise in a variety of different situations and circumstances, and with many different species. We work in partnership with many of the major oil companies. We have assured response contracts with many of the majors and respond certainly whenever there's a need as far as those contracts go. We're also involved a lot in oil wildlife planning and training, certainly helping to have areas as prepared as possible to respond. It's really one of the most key aspects of a successful response to wildlife impact by oil. We have a relatively small team, but we're able to expand that team, and in the Gulf of Mexico we had nearly 90 specialist oil wildlife responders working with us. We also, as I said, we operate 2 year-round wildlife rehabilitation centers in California, and together they care for about 5,000 animals. The 2 centers that we manage, one in Los Angeles and one in San Francisco, are dedicated aquatic bird rescue facilities. They're also unique in that they are part of California's oil wildlife planning and a part of the oil wildlife care network that exists in California. So as well as us operating our rehabilitation program for aquatic birds 365 days a year, these facilities also stand ready to respond in the event of an oil spill. So the plan really is that these centers are completely equipped, specifically designed, and with the central hub for any oil wildlife rescue efforts in California. In terms of our response team, we bring together a range of different fields of expertise, from wildlife rehabilitation, veterinarians, marine biologists, and of course administrators and emergency managers. Of course, all of those components come together in an oil wildlife response. We have team members in the US, but we also have team members internationally, some of which are here and based here in Brazil. And we will pull people in from different parts of the world to work as part of our broader response team. Here in Brazil, we're very proud to be able to work in partnership with Ayuca. We have known the founders of Ayuca for many years, and Ayuca is a consultancy that has been set up here really to specialize in the planning for and response to oil wildlife here in Brazil. And we are working with them to provide Tier 3 support, so that if there was a catastrophic event here in the country, we would come in and work in partnership with the team here from Ayuca to really help to support the response to a large-scale oil spill. We were also very fortunate to be able to call on some of the team from Ayuca to work with us internationally, and I think that I would say you're very fortunate here in Brazil to have some of the most experienced oil wildlife responders in South America. Just a little bit about the effects of oil on wildlife. I think in many situations people think about the ingestion of oil from wildlife and the concern of the toxicity of the oil. And while that certainly can be an issue, certainly when that oil is particularly toxic in the early days of a spill, but really primarily, most often, the situations that we are dealing with are more immediate than that. And it has a lot to do with the way these birds are set up and how they survive in the wild. Many of the species that we work with spend some, if not all, of their life in water, and they depend on their own waterproofing to survive and thrive in the wild. The feather structure of these birds creates a natural barrier to water. Each of the feathers have these microscopic hooks that lock together and actually just prevent water from entering into the feathers and onto the skin. And so with a combination of these outer feathers that lock together and the soft, warm, downy feathers underneath, these birds are able to stay warm and dry even in the harshest of conditions. Of course, when oil affects feathers, it impacts that waterproofing barrier. And so what you have if that bird is out at sea is immediate kind of water seeping into those feathers. It makes the bird heavier, it makes the bird cold, makes it impossible for them to regulate, and many times if that bird is close to the the coast, it will actually try to get out of the water itself. If it's not near the coast, the likelihood is that it may well die at sea. But essentially, what we're working with here is hypothermia, dehydration, and actually starvation, because those animals will get to a point where they're so debilitated that they actually cannot feed, and will often, if they can get out of the water, spend all of their time trying to remove the oil themselves and almost forget about eating. So those are the things that we're working with in the early days of a spill. And that is why, in terms of the different elements of a response, we really do focus on a proactive capture of these animals, that we talk about a window of opportunity, which is that we have a very small amount of time to make a difference to these animals. And certainly, if the conditions are harsh, they're in a cold environment, then we need to have an organized plan to be able to recover animals as quickly as possible, so that we can get them warm, we can stabilize them, so that they can actually survive the process of rehabilitation. These are just some of the key elements and stages of an oil wildlife response. So, of course, as I said at the beginning, recovery and transport. Sometimes that can happen at sea, sometimes it happens on shore, can involve many, many people covering a large area. The Gulf spill was an example of that. Processing and intaking of those animals, so we can really determine if there's any intensive care needed. We can establish some basic health parameters of those animals, and essentially begin to get them stabilized, get them warm, work with any dehydration, get plenty of fluids, and high protein food, so we can really also start to build up their strength and their body weight. Many people, when they think about responding to oiled wildlife, they think about the washing of those animals, and actually washing those animals immediately that they are rescued is actually one of the worst things that you can do in many cases. There are some exceptions to that based on species, but mostly you really have to make sure that those animals are stabilized before you even consider the washing. It's probably the most stressful part of the entire process on the animals. It can take about 40 to 50 minutes for the washing and rinsing to occur, and as I said, normally it's at least a few days where we make sure that that animal is stable and strong and able to survive the wash. The washing has two components. First of all, we wash the bird using dish detergents, and then the second component is a rinse, which is with a high pressure rinse nozzle. It's just as important for us to remove the soap as it is to remove the oil, and this is where you actually start to see the feathers returning to their natural state. And even though you're spraying the bird with water, you can actually start to see water beginning to bead off the feathers when you're starting to remove that soap. The next key element of the process is the conditioning, which is essentially working with the animals, letting them work through it themselves, but essentially the process of them regaining their waterproofing. What we're trying to do is gradually reintroduce them to being able to survive in cold water. So generally in those first few days, they're not in a position in terms of the way their feathers are aligned to be out in a cold water pool on a permanent basis. So what we'll do is we'll gradually move them into those pools, so they spend more and more time there each day, to the point where, depending on the species, they may well be in there for 24 hours without any way of hauling out or getting out of the water. So we can really determine that when we release them back into the ocean, they're going to be strong enough and 100% waterproof to be able to thrive and feed. And then, of course, finally, the point that we all really live for is the release of these animals. And of course, that is always a coordinated effort in an oil spill to make sure that we are releasing animals in a clean environment. We're not returning them to an impacted area where they may become oiled again. And I'll talk a little bit about those challenges when I talk about the Deepwater Horizon response. I do want to stress that this really is a complex and specialized field. It's a profession that has been developing every year as we learn more and more about how to successfully save these animals. Many techniques have developed, and an understanding of how to work with the variety of species that can be impacted. Here you have a western grebe, and this is an animal that rarely, if at all, leaves the water. It's simply not designed to rest on a hard surface. And so here it's actually sitting in a net bottom cage, which allows for a little bit more support so that that bird doesn't develop any secondary issues. It doesn't develop any lesions on its keel bone, which otherwise could be a reason why that bird does not actually get to be released. We're also measuring the internal impacts and certainly the basic health parameters of the birds. We take regular blood samples throughout the process so we can really understand any specific needs that those animals have. And of course the washing process itself and all the different elements that come together, there's many different ways that it can go wrong, and it really takes people who understand how all these things come together to make it work successfully. I think one of the most amazing examples of all of this coming together, and I mentioned it before, is the response to the Treasure oil spill in Cape Town. And what you're bringing together when a situation affects this many animals is you're bringing together the understanding of how to care for an individual animal, and you're applying it to a situation that involves tens of thousands. And so what you're doing is aligning those animal care techniques with logistics, response management, and all these different elements that would come into making it successful. Fortunately, in this situation, the authorities were very well prepared, having experienced an oil spill in previous years that had caused them to stockpile and prepare equipment and to create a plan. And so it was really that pre-planning that really allowed us to be as successful in that response as we were. And as I said, 20,000 penguins that were oiled, 94% of them were released. So that brings us to last year in the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. Unprecedented in many ways, as I'm sure many of you, if not all, know. This was an offshore rig explosion that happened on April 20th, 2010. The largest oil spill in US history, now replacing the Exxon Valdez, which was certainly the biggest for many years. 250 million gallons of oil spilled, and unique in many ways. One that, of course, the release of oil continued for some time. The area that was impacted was huge, and there was a diverse array of countermeasures that were implemented in this response, and some of which have unknown impacts to wildlife. And I'll talk a little bit about those in a moment. For those that are familiar to some degree with oil spill response, certainly the incident command system was used, and I think there were particular complexities in this situation because of the nation-wide response. So what you had actually in this response is a system, of course, ultimately reporting up through to the Department of Homeland Security and the President himself, but one in which you had a unified area command, and then underneath that you had that area command broken down into these different areas, often by state, but essentially so that you were breaking that organizational structure down even further. Certainly there were numerous federal and state agencies involved. Of course, 4 different states impacted and responding, and so of course in a situation like this, the incident command system really helps with the organization, but certainly it's a hugely complex and confusing situation, certainly in terms of decision making on the ground. I'm not expecting you to see this necessarily, but here's the wildlife branch. So in this whole response to the Deepwater Horizon, you have these 4 key sections: operations, planning, logistics, and finance. And the wildlife branch is a component of operations. So you have a wildlife branch director who's overseeing that piece of the response, reporting into the operations section of that command system. The wildlife response itself can be broken down, and certainly often it's broken down and separated between wild birds and mammals. In this situation, because of the potential impact, that was the case. And then within that, we'll break the system down, depending on the size, into the different sections, all the way from the recovery and transport, stabilization, all the way through to the volunteer coordination, which is often critical to the response as well. As some of you may know, in the US, wildlife response is actually federally mandated. It's been that way since the Oil Pollution Act of 1990, which came about after the Exxon Valdez. And so at this point, there is an expectation of a plan to be in place for wildlife, and as I said, it's integrated into that command system. And again, we've worked in many countries where that has not been the case, and really it is critical to the success of the operation for it to really be considered a component of the incident command itself. As I mentioned, this is potential impact was a huge area of coastline, all the way from Texas down through Florida. One of the particular complexities with this situation, and I think it also speaks to the history of this area, and particularly in the response to Hurricane Katrina, and some of the challenges with that, is that there were certain, I guess, sensitivities that really had to be taken into consideration. And one of them in this instance was that each of the states really wanted to have its own wildlife rehabilitation facility. In most situations, we would strongly advise the opposite of that, that it's actually better to create stabilization centers in different remote locations and really try to get the animals as concentrated into one facility as you can, just like in the example in South Africa. That's the best way to make sure that you're really creating consistent techniques and approaches to that animal's care. In this situation, we weren't able to do that, but our organization, along with Tri-State Bird Rescue, essentially took over the management of each of those facilities in the 4 states. So as I said, it's a Gulf-wide response. There were a variety of state and federal agencies involved in each of the states. Of course, legal jurisdiction over the natural resources fell in many instances to those states. And so you really had to have this variety of stakeholders really working together to come up with solutions. And of course, that was happening under intense media interest. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few slides, but certainly that was one of the biggest challenges, and I think for me a take-home message of this presentation is understanding that media interest, and particularly in an oil spill, how that media interest will very much focus in on the wildlife response. The variety of countermeasures that we used in this spill, and in terms of the impact on wildlife, some of those are unknown. Or that there's a lot more research to be done. So certainly in terms of the dispersants, this is something that I think in terms of any secondary impacts that dispersants may have on wildlife, that's something that I think needs more research on our end. The in-situ burning that was happening, potential just from fumes and the impact of that on wildlife. And these pom-pom booms here, which have the potential to entangle animals and seabirds. So these are just some of the challenges that we were working with in this response. In terms of resources at risk, of course, the Gulf of Mexico is abundant with wildlife. In terms of species, there's over 1,200 species of fish, over 200 species of birds, number of sea turtles, marine mammals. I'm going to talk about the bird numbers in this spill, but as well as the birds impacted, there was about 400 sea turtles that were recovered, and I believe about 800 nesting sites that were being monitored, and in some instances, animals being moved to avoid them being oiled. One of the things to remember about this spill as well is that Louisiana had recovered from a potential decimation of the pelican population in the 1960s as a result of the use of pesticides. And in fact, what had happened in the 60s and 70s is the pelicans had been reintroduced from Florida. And so it had got to the point where in 2010 there were 25 to 33,000 breeding pairs in and around the islands off the coast of Louisiana. So certainly a tremendous success to get the animals up to that number. But here we were looking at a situation that may seriously impact those pelicans again. And many of those nesting islands are incredibly low-lying, so all it would have taken is a storm or hurricane to have really had a huge major impact on those populations. There were a few directives that we were working with for this response from the Unified Command. One was to use local resources as much as possible. As I mentioned about each state really wanting to run its own wildlife response and feel like they could do that. There was a request for us not to use volunteers, so as well as our team of experts that we brought in, we worked with a number of paraprofessionals, people who were veterinary students or rehabilitators of other wildlife, people who had some experience of working with animals. So that rather than using volunteers, we were using these local people and hopefully training them in the process to be prepared for future instances. We were also having to coordinate transport with a variety of kind of local authorities, and one of the directives here was actually to really minimize international help, which in terms of oil wildlife response, it's certainly something that was unfortunate, I think, for us, knowing that we work with many experienced oil wildlife professionals around the world, and it really is a specific field in and of itself, and it would have been wonderful for us to have been able to brought in some of those experts to really work alongside us. This is just a cluster of the organizations that were involved in the wildlife response effort, federal and state agencies, and then of course International Bird Rescue and Tri-State Bird Rescue that are based on the east coast of the US, and we were really the two organizations managing the oil bird rehabilitation. In this particular situation, the field operations, the recovery and transport was actually managed by the US Fish and Wildlife Service. It took hundreds of their personnel to cover the areas impacted. And of course there's a whole variety of challenges to that operation, from the weather to operational tasks. I mentioned before some of the use of in-situ burning and dispersants, skimming, just many different factors that really went into to affecting how and when these people could be out on the water looking for impacted wildlife. Certainly the heat too was a huge issue. We were dealing with temperatures of over 40, 45 degrees, if not more, and the command system itself implemented a 20-minute work, 40-minute rest cycle for everybody working in the field. So, which was essential just to avoid heat stress, but of course it creates some real challenges when you're trying to really maximize the time out there to look for and capture wildlife. So in the end, as I said, we ended up with 4 wildlife facilities in 4 different states. There were a variety of challenges with some of these facilities, and in particular, I think in Louisiana, where it ended up being that we received the most impacted animals. There was some real challenges in terms of the location of that facility and some of the logistical challenges that it brought, and I'll talk a little bit about that. This facility is in a place called Fort Jackson, which is really down in the kind of the fingers of Louisiana, southwest of New Orleans. It was a response warehouse, an empty warehouse that was used to contain some response equipment. And the Mississippi River was about 25 meters this way. And during Hurricane Katrina, this entire warehouse was underwater to about here. So we were very aware that we were entering hurricane season, and we were highly concerned that if we filled this warehouse up with animals and we needed to move the facility in an emergency, that would cause some real issues. So at the beginning of the response, the planning began to think about a relocation option for this center, so we could actually move out of the hurricane evacuation zone. One of the other challenges to this space is that they had no air conditioning, which again, when you're dealing with the temperatures in the summer in the Gulf, was a huge issue both for the animals and also for the people. We also had, despite the fact that the river was right next to us, some real challenges with getting water into the center. And all of the caging that you see here had to be built from scratch. So again, this is taking serious time away from that small window of opportunity that you have when you have to build this from scratch rather than having something in place that's ready to use. This is our team leader in the response, Jay Holcomb. He's one of the most experienced oil wildlife responders in the world, and this is the washing station in that warehouse, and that was it full to capacity, basically allowing for just 2 teams washing birds, and the team here is actually working on a pre-treatment. The birds were so heavily oiled that we had to pre-treat them with a methyl soyate, a light oil, which we would actually soak them in for about an hour before they were washed, and that would just start to break down the heavy crude, so that when we actually put them through the wash, that oil would more easily break off and wash away. But again, in a situation where we have thousands of animals, we may have 10, 20 wash teams all working at once. In the South African response, we were washing 500 birds every day. We knew in this situation that if we got really heavily bombarded with animals, that we would have a severe problem keeping up, because we had no way to expand the facility. And so again, it really motivated the discussions around finding an alternative location for the response. Another challenge, of course, in most places that you respond is that you're going to be working with multiple species. In this situation, it ended up largely being pelicans, and they come with their own set of problems just in the fact that they're a large bird. They require a lot of space, as well as the indoor spacing. You also need to create outdoor spacing and pools for those animals to bathe, and of course that creates a whole other level of needs and requirements. We also had a variety of other species that also required specific caging and specific care. I mentioned the media interest in this response, and on an average day at the center in Louisiana, we would see about 50 media outlets arriving for the lunchtime press conference. So this was a daily sight for the team that were running the washroom. Just this incredible level of interest. Of course, it creates some serious challenges, and I think that what we saw is the moment that these images appeared on TV, that all of a sudden the public and the media interest really just skyrocketed. We were giving media tours on a daily basis, and at one point we needed to pull that back, and we're just giving those tours every other day. And it was very interesting to see how that played out, because all of a sudden the story would shifted towards the sense of somehow we were keeping the media outside. There was some kind of secret that we weren't letting them see, which was certainly not the case. We were really just trying to plan and care for the animals and make sure that that media interest didn't have an impact. But again, it really goes to show how important it is to find a good plan and allow some media access, so that there's some sense that the public can really see that there's a high level of care and attention being taken to the efforts which I think in many instances the public really expect to see. As well as the media, we also had countless VIP visits, often unexpected. Certainly some of that was governmental. This is Governor Bobby Jindal, who is the governor of Louisiana, and this is the New Orleans Saints football team, who arrived all together one day, and they would have been pretty good help in the washroom, but they only stayed for an hour or so. But this is just some of the additional things that you don't plan for necessarily, but also need to find people to be able to give tours and make sure that people feel somehow part of the response within the community. As I mentioned, we were preparing for the unexpected, and there were a number of hurricanes that were sighted off the coast that had the potential to come all the way through the Gulf of Mexico. And so, as I said, the plans that we had in place were that we wanted to really relocate that facility as quickly as we possibly could. In the end, that didn't happen as fast as we would have liked it to, but I'm pleased to say that we were able to relocate that entire operation. And that happened midway through this response, while we had quite a large number of animals in that facility. And the alternative location that was found is a warehouse just north of New Orleans, north of the evacuation zone in Louisiana. And it was a warehouse four warehouses on 7 acres of land in a place called Hammond, Louisiana. You can see from some of these photos that this was a much bigger facility. We would have loved to have been in here from the beginning, and certainly we knew in setting this facility up that we had the ability to care for tens of thousands of animals if need be. I mentioned about the variety of species, and as well as the outdoor housing, we're also thinking indoor housing. And so here you have caging for pelicans. All of this had to be pre-built. Of course, you have a variety of different species that you're working with, kind of waders and other species that you need to really think about while they're in the facility to minimize stress and have them, really minimize any potential impact for secondary issues occurring while they're in captivity. Just some of the photos from inside, and again, you'll see that this facility is a completely different world to the facility we had in Fort Jackson, with a variety of intake areas and treatment areas, a huge washing area that could cope with quite a number of wash teams, and certainly plenty of pool space outside. As I mentioned, the conditioning, the re-waterproofing of these animals is a really key component of this effort, and so there are some simple things that can be easily overlooked in terms of just the quality of the water the way that you have the pool set up. We really want these animals to be able to bathe, to be able to preen, and over a series of days, they're actually the ones that kind of work out the issues in their own feathers. They're the ones that really kind of, get their waterproofing back to really being ready to be released. And then, of course, as well as evaluating that waterproofing, we're also just making sure that other basic health parameters are in place, final blood checks, physical examination, really just to make sure that that animal fully passes our checklist of criteria for that animal to be able to be released. The release logistics in this spill were staggeringly complex. First of all, you had a situation where you were unable to transport animals if the temperature was over 40 degrees. And so first of all, we had to make a decision that we were only going to transport animals at night. You also had a situation where the oil spill was continuing, and so in many instances, even if these animals were rescued in Louisiana, we were actually transporting them by air to places as far away as Florida and Georgia. It would involve approval on the local state level and also on the federal level, and we'd also have to involve air ops, so that we transported these animals first of all by truck, and then they would get airlifted to the release site. So an incredibly complex operation, just to make sure that the animals were far enough away from the spill itself to reduce the impact of them getting re-oiled. Later in the spill, as things calmed down, we were able to identify some sites to release some of the juvenile birds locally in Louisiana, which certainly helped a great deal in terms of starting to minimize those release logistics. And as I say, we had to involve the US Coast Guard on a number of those operations. In terms of the numbers of animals impacted by this spill, at least that were recovered, there was just over 2,000 oil birds, live oil birds, that were admitted to the 4 facilities that we had set up in the Gulf. And of those, just over 1,200 were successfully released. That is a release rate of about 60%, which actually, in terms of the lack of planning in this situation, or the lack of planning for a response of this scale, was actually a really good release rate. There are certainly a whole bunch of variables in an oil spill response in terms of wildlife, and certainly how prepared you are really goes a long way into affecting the success. But as I said, in the end, over half of those animals were successfully released. In terms of some of the challenges, as I mentioned, the heat was a huge challenge in this situation. I think just the intensity of the spill response itself meant that communication was always a challenge at those different levels of the command. The thickness, the heaviness of this particular crew made it a real challenge. As I said, we had to work with this pre-treatment on all the animals that came through. And certainly just the level of challenges logistically, but also just the political intensity of this situation, and of course the media interest that came as a result of that really added to the pressures I think all of us faced being down there last year. And I think as far as just take-home messages for being here in Brazil, I think that certainly for us it's always a reminder that it's always about preparation. It's really about having an understanding of how to bring all of these specialist areas together into a coordinated effort. It's certainly about having people that have the kind of experience where they already understand this work. They're able to come in and really manage this in an emergency situation and bring those skills with them. And I think it's also about understanding that the public in many ways expects there to be a response that really includes wildlife, and that by really having it as an integrated part of the response and really identified as a professional field in and of itself really goes a long way to making sure that it succeeds just as you want all the different aspects of the oil spill response to succeed. Muito obrigado.